Thank you so much, Casey, and the other Dr. Tomko too. I've known Casey since freshman year, so it's just lovely to see her here tonight as a sort of first-year graduate student, and that almost made me cry, which is not a good start to a lecture on humour. Although maybe it is, I don't know. Anyway, so I am really excited to be giving this lecture today, possibly overexcited because we have cancelled it and rescheduled it so many times. It's like, wow, we're doing it. I've been teaching in this department for over a decade, but I'm one of the last among my colleagues to give a faith and reason lecture. Giving this lecture has been a rite of passage for us all, and over the years I've admired the intelligence, imagination, and good humor of my colleagues' contributions to the series. Knowing that my turn would come, I decided several years ago that my faith and reason lecture would be about humor, about what makes us laugh, and why this is an important question. I chose this topic in gratitude for the mirth I have shared with my dear colleagues and with so many students in Villanova classrooms over the years. Studying and teaching how the human person can flourish in relation to others, to the world around us, and to God is a happy business for me. In the Department of Humanities, we call our senior capstone a symposium, a banquet, because we believe that your study should conclude in the celebration of the intellectual life, a great feast at which we're convened and at which in some ways we'll always be together. And at the best feasts, at the best times, good jokes and hearty laughter will abound. But as I started to think about this lecture over winter break, that's how long ago I wrote this poem, as 2020's cold conclusion became 2021's chilling start, it was tempting to give up before I began. Surely this was not the best point in history to be talking about why we laugh. So much of what we have endured in the last year and a half has not been a laughing matter. For many people, the strange months of pandemic living and all the tension that's accompanied it have undermined what we think is normal, even what we think is possible in our lives. It can feel as if everything's gone sour, as if our world has gone off, as if it's past its best before date, and the supply chains are bad. There doesn't seem to be another one coming. Maybe we'll look back on these years as the Great Pandemic, just as we now call the economic crisis of 2008 the Great Recession. But I'd like to propose that it's often felt more like the Great Souring. We've all needed to get serious just to keep going, and for many, life has never seemed as humorless as it has since everything went topsy-turvy in March 2020. But as soon as I say the word topsy-turvy, guess what? We have entered the realm of the comic. Indeed, one good definition of comedy is the turning upside down of things in order to see them better or right. Think about the classic slapstick moment when the butt of the joke trips and falls flat down with the legs in the air. This is funny because we know that the comedian, however hard he fell, will quickly be back on his feet again, set aright. So to get things started today, I'm going to cheer us up a bit with a clip of a classic pratfall from the British sitcom Miranda. It's going to be the first of several case studies in humour around which I am going to build my argument. In the clip you're about to watch, Miranda, played by comedian Miranda Hart, has just been to a funeral and is characteristically regretting something embarrassing she has just done. She's walking along with her always perfect, very snobby mother, but she's also a very deeply loyal mother. And you're going to hear Miranda say, "I wish the ground could have swallowed me up." It's very good, Miranda, I recommend it. So, off-screen, this moment would not really have been funny. Even performing it makes me wonder, did the actress hurt herself in achieving such a genius comic fall? Can you believe her mother just walked off, leaving her in the grave? Because it's just comedy, we don't need to worry about any of this, or even the dark symbolism of falling into a grave. Miranda's back in the next scene, uninjured, comically resurrected, living to tell the tale, crack the next joke, and to have lunch with her mother. The simple observation that I want to start with here is that laughter, whatever it is, allows us to reimagine the worst things imaginable, in this instance, embarrassment and death, as marvelously continuous with the best things. Continuous with hope, with healing, with life, to name a few. If we do live in times that often don't seem funny, we also live in times in which hope seems a rationed commodity, healing is difficult, and when continuities are hard to come by. And so if talking about humor is a way to talk about reimagining the worst as the best, I hope you'll agree with me by the end of this evening that thinking about what it means to have a good laugh is more than just a side note to the serious business of our place in history. So in the next 35 minutes or so, I want to raise our expectations about our splendid shared sense of humor. What it is, how we can use and abuse it, and what it promises us about being truly, fully alive. And get ready to tell me what you think at the end in our Q&A. My hope is to illustrate humor's grandeur via a reflection on humor, on literature I love, and on theological and philosophical ideas that help me to make sense of both literature and life. I'm going to do this while considering what laughter can look like in what I'll call the age of snark. I'll be building towards the claim that when we recognize laughter's potential in our lives, we'll notice just how grateful we can be for the great gift of human humor, and just how risky it is when we misuse it. This gratitude for humor is tied closely with our capacity for gratitude toward one another, not to mention our capacity to use and misuse one another. Talking about humor isn't always that funny, so I can't promise many /Eddie jokes, but I do hope to persuade you tonight that there's more of our life in our laughter and more room for laughter in our lives than we sometimes realize or allow. When we find ourselves deprived of the oxygen of comedy, suffocated by snark, when we consent to indulge in words rather than a better sense of humor, when we forget how to laugh together, what hangs in the balance is nothing less than our highest goods and our most serious aspirations. Many of my examples will be familiar to students who've taken classes in humanities, and for some of you this will be a bit like humanities bingo. We will be paying our respects to Karamazov brothers, Underground Man, Nietzsche's Zarathustra, Dante, Jane Austen, and C.S. Lewis's Aslan will show up. Not in person. And because this is the Faith and Reason lecture, I'll be taking flight on the wings of faith and reason as I look around at history and culture for other touchstones and testaments. So, here's the plan. I have 3 sections and 3 questions. What is laughter for and what are its powers? That's number 1. Number 2, why does laughter sometimes hurt? And number 3, can laughter heal us too? What would that look like? So, do we know what our... Do we know what our laughter is? What's it for? What are its powers? One famous book on the topic by vitalist philosopher Henri Bergson begins with the inauspicious claim that the question of what laughter means has a knack of baffling every effort, of slipping away and escaping only to bob up again, a pert challenge flung at philosophic speculation. Laughter and humor might well be very baffling, but many minds have set themselves the task of trying to understand it. Among all the various theories, 3 explanations consistently show up in discussions of what laughter is. I find each of these explanations fairly compelling, and you're seeing behind me examples of what I'm talking about. So the first classic explanation of why we laugh is the superiority theory. Why do we laugh at Michael Scott in The Office? He may be the boss at Dunder Mifflin, but every time Jim Halpert or Pam Beesly raises an eyebrow at the camera, we're drawn into laughter at this buffoon. He might have the corner office, but he's the one getting cornered. And in the privacy of our own Netflix accounts, we're quite happy to share in Jim and Pam's amusement. We're united with them in a corrective laughter that reassures us of our shared superiority over the butt of the joke, however lovable Michael Scott might be. The top dog doesn't realize he's the underdog, and laughing at him suggests a kind of subversive power. Second classic example of why we laugh is the relief theory. This one is associated with Freudian psychology and describes the kind of laughter that's a release of pent-up nervous energy. Have you ever found yourself laughing uncontrollably at the worst possible, most inappropriate moments? I think we all have. While carrying a heavy piece of furniture upstairs. That's a favorite one in my family. When someone important's high heel broke. At a funeral. No comment. Who did that? The relief theory explains this often unwelcome, embarrassing laughter as a release of energy that otherwise would be used to repress our responses to a difficult situation. This laughter can be a particular liability for giggly teenagers, but even the old and grey among us are not immune to its embarrassing interruptions. The relief theory suggests that we're governed by powers within ourselves that aren't always rational and can't always be suppressed. Now, the third classic example or theory of why we laugh is the incongruity theory, according to which what makes us laugh is something being or acting other than we expect. So the adult who's singing his heart out in the children's choir, the dog on a skateboard, the skirt tucked accidentally into the underwear, the discovery that in the United Kingdom saran wrap is called cling film and aluminum foil is called aluminium foil. These are not necessarily laugh out loud funny, but you did laugh. So I know from experience that each of these incongruities can make people and transatlantic family laugh. This laughter originates in the power of the human mind to discern and distinguish and to be surprised. It allows us to teeter on the brink between new and old worlds, between our expectations about life and what life surprises us with. But however compelling these theories, and however much they account for on their own or in combination, each leaves me feeling that something is missing. Think about a baby laughing. Most babies smile and laugh in the early weeks of life, well before they can roll over or sit up. For a new parent, that first laugh is an extraordinary moment, a revelation. Just a few weeks ago, this baby was a hidden mystery in utero. Now she chuckles when you do something unexpected and when you do it again and again and again. I don't think the superiority theory or the relief theory can tell us much about babies' laughter. Probably the incongruity theory works better. But how many parents will be satisfied with the explanation that their baby is laughing because she's noticed something incongruous? The baby's laughter seems to be about so much more. It percolates with burgeoning trust, with joy, with recognition, with affirmation. It percolates with the goodness of a little person who is learning to dialogue in laughter well before she can do so in words. The baby's laughter is also really contagious. When we find ourselves laughing at her laughing, something restorative happens. Who doesn't want to join in that chuckling dialogue of familiar trust and joyful affirmation? The mysterious revelatory power of babies' laughter is an anchor for my thoughts today. Whatever theory of laughter we land on, whether it's philosophical or physiological or psychological, it shouldn't exclude what I'd like to call the baby's laughter of unadulterated dependence. A laugh so powerful it can restore the most sleep-deprived adult. The baby in her total dependence and vulnerability cannot explain any of this any more than she explained why she learned how to cry as soon as she was born, well before giggles. But even though she's nowhere near the age of reason, she's witnessing to two remarkable facts about Homo sapiens. We're not just sapient creatures, we're also Homo ridens and Homo lacrimans, creatures distinguished by very human laughter and very human tears, spontaneous bodily expressions of our amazing capacity for joys and sorrows. This is exactly how W.E.B. Du Bois recalls the short life of his infant son in his beautiful essay of the passing of the firstborn. I can see him now, writes Du Bois of his deceased baby boy, changing like the sky from sparkling laughter to darkening frowns and to wondering thoughtfulness as he watched the world. I think there's something majestic in the meteorological description of what laughter and its consorts are like in this little passage. From the littlest baby to the oldest among us, we're living out our lives between tears and laughter. And the baby is our best witness to this with every spontaneous eruption of raw human emotion. This observation takes us toward a far grander vision of what laughter is and what its powers are than any of the three theories of laughter I just mentioned can do on their own. In his Poetics, Aristotle offered classic definitions of comedy and tragedy considered in relation to theatrical drama. We know more about Aristotle's thoughts on tragedy than on comedy, but his ideas hold interest well beyond theatre. Tragedy, according to Aristotle, represents the actions of noble characters who experience a change in fortune from good to bad, happy to sad. The tragic protagonist makes a terrible error and suffers its consequences. The audience watches and experiences pity and terror, a form of catharsis, a purifying of these emotions through art. Pain for Aristotle is the mother of tragedy. Comedy does the opposite. It lacks the nobility of tragedy, but its characters undergo a change in fortune from bad to good. Comic catharsis purifies the audience's emotions not through pain, but through pleasure and laughter. And so laughter is the mother of comedy, exposing errors of body and soul as a way to correct and heal them. Aristotle's hunch that comic and tragic art can purify our emotions escorts us into the question of how art affects its spectators and its readers. Aristotle's theory also suggests what we can call the cosmic dimensions of tragedy and comedy. The same questions we can ask about a Shakespeare play, we can also ask about the cosmos we inhabit. Is this all careening towards some apocalyptic tragedy? It can feel like that on a rainy Tuesday morning. Or are things bounding along like a puppy on a spring day toward a comic resolution in which all's well that ends well? In Shakespeare's tragedy King Lear, Edgar, the son of the Duke of Gloucester, summarizes the comic outlook really well. Unlikely in a great tragedy, but he does. Things have been going really badly for him, but he resolves to look on the bright side. To be worst, he says, the lowest and most dejected thing of fortune stands still in hope, lives not in fear. The lamentable change is from the best. The worst returns to laughter. What he's saying is that if you hit rock bottom, the only exit is upward. The worst is preferable to the best, thinks Edgar, because the best still has the potential to go downhill fast. If the joke is on poor Edgar, whose father is about to arrive having just had his eyes gouged out, things can and do get much worse, it turns out. But whilst Shakespeare's play has a famously tragic ending, Edgar himself gets a comic resolution. He's one of the few left standing to rebuild Lear's kingdom and perhaps to make good on his hope of returning things to laughter. The baby who lives her early months between screams and giggles turns out to be a good emblem for the dramatic arc of Edgar's and our own lives. Is this all going to end in tears? Or can we hope for our very own comic resolution in the end? Salvation history has a ready answer to these questions. In St. Luke's Gospel, when Christ teaches about how our earthly lives can participate in the divine life, he promises, "Blessed are you that weep now, for you will laugh." These words parallel Psalm 126, which proclaims that those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. Right at the end of the Bible, in Revelation, we find prophecy that in the heavenly Jerusalem, God will wipe away every tear, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. When we stack these quotes together, it seems that while tears will be among the former things that pass away for souls in beatitude, laughter belongs somehow in beatitude. It has a foothold in eternity. Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection make good once and for all on what Shakespeare's Edgar hoped, that the worst returns to laughter. Victory over death and sin is on this argument both cosmic and comic, because Christ once and for all does away with the twin tragedies of sin and death. This argument is one way to understand the title, just one way, to understand the title of Dante's Divine Comedy. Mortal humanity has been running headlong toward the tragedy of death since the fall. The poetry of Dante's Inferno witnesses to souls who have chosen an unrepentant, tragic course for themselves rather than freely accepting the grace won for them by the incarnate God. Dante shows the comic shape of redemption not just in the logic of his poem, but also in its laughs. Hell is the place of just derision. On Mount Purgatory, Dante stifles giggles when Statius the Roman poet doesn't recognize his hero Virgil. In the earthly paradise, Dante makes himself the butt of Beatrice's mockery. In Paradiso, he even mistakes Beatrice's kind smiles, her blessed sense of humor, for the vision of the Godhead. This all adds up to an old argument that Christianity bears the promise of divine comedy and the hope that the bitterest of tragic tears can become the healing balm of joyful laughter. All right, so section number 2. Having built toward these questions on laughter's potentially redemptive, reflections on laughter's potentially redemptive powers, it's time to ask my second question. So why does laughter hurt so much? Because we all know that in addition to our friendly giggles, polite chuckles, and celebratory whoops, our laughter can manifest itself in snarls and sniggers and weird hilarity. I've described babies' laughter as the laughter of unadulterated dependence. What name can we give to laughter that has the power to hurt? The scripture passage I've just cited tips us off to the need for such distinctions between types of laughter. Christ promises the blessing of laughter beyond tears, but a few lines later he says the opposite. Woe to you that laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. He can't be banishing laughter, having just described it as proper to beatitude, a gift in this life and in the next. I think he's warning against what we can call the laughter of the age. Most likely laughter armed with the rhetorical weapons of satire, irony, sarcasm, and derision. Although it finds different expression in different ages, laughter that hurts likely always magnifies the brokenness and tribal tensions that humanity has been encountering on school buses, Twitter feeds, and in other public spaces throughout all ages. And it is this laughter that runs the abusive risks I alluded to at the start of my lecture. Before explaining my worries about laughter's darker powers, I should clarify that I am not arguing against the very necessary laughter of satire that will be present in any free society. In fact, my interest in this topic originates in a clear example of the need for satirical laughter that has to hurt in order to hit home. Most of my scholarship, as Casey said, focuses on German literature in the early 20th century. I've written a lot about the cultural critic that no one's ever heard of, Theodor Hecker, who made a name for himself writing anti-jingoist satires during the First World War. Whether right or wrong in his arguments, Hecker had no qualms about absolutely lacerating his opponents with sharp words. All's fair in war and satire. But around the time of his conversion to Catholicism in 1921, conscience struck. Is anyone capable of satire without cruelty? He asked himself. Based on his own experience, he feared that even if we need satire to remedy the stupidities of public life, it can trap us in a state of sneering despair that undermines our capacity for better writing and for better virtues, namely those anchored in justice and love. Hecker resolved to suppress his satirical tendencies and try a more generous, gentle mode of writing. But Europe in the 1920s and 1930s really needed satire. In fact, he recognized as first Mussolini and then Hitler came to power.
Oh, God.
Reluctantly, he dusted off his satirist pen. It was bad. It was bad. Reluctantly, he dusted off his satirist pen to deride these ideologues, remaining convinced that one true good satirical laugh should have broken the hold that fascism had on too many European minds. When Hitler came to power, Hecker nearly lost his freedom because of a satirical essay decrying Nazism. That didn't happen. But under the censorship of the Third Reich, the choice for or against satire no longer existed. The suppression of satire's salutary swipes is one obvious hallmark of tyranny. So putting to one side this important moral function of satire with its toolkit of irony, sarcasm, and wit, what I want to focus on is Hecker's worry that being satirical and being ironic, being sarcastic, or even being snarkastic can be a risky business for the life of the soul. The fiction of Fyodor Dostoevsky offers extreme examples of what worried Hecker, namely laughter that injures both those being laughed at and the one doing the laughing, trapping everyone in a cycle of what Hecker called infinite satire. If you've read Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, you will remember how the narrator is terrorized by paranoid resentments. He's convinced that we, his readers, are laughing at him. Like a child whose reserves have been depleted by the class bully, Underground Man is convinced that he deserves all the mocking laughter he's projecting onto himself. You might think that living in fear of mockery would disable somebody's capacity to mock. But no, he perpetuates the cynical cycle, convinced that derision is the way of the world. Dostoevsky thematizes laughter as the measure of human life even more powerfully in his last novel, Brothers Karamazov, in which each character is defined by a strange vintage of laughter. Daddy Karamazov's bizarre, inappropriate laughter inspires the murderous loathing of his sons. His oldest, Dmitri, contracts his father's dread of being mocked, while Ivan inherits his father's dreadful gift of mockery. Do you remember the baby's laughter, the laughter of unadulterated dependence? I think each of these men laughs a laughter of desperate independence. Laughter that hurts everyone as it bites at bonds of love owed to father, brother, lover, friend, and self. I am very glad that neither the Karamazovs nor Underground Man had the opportunity to tweet or troll. They would have all been far too good at it. I bet there's a fake account, isn't there, somewhere, for all of them. But Dostoevsky's sharp ear for the full repertoire of human laughter, ranging from destructive to ecstatic, and how this laughter correlates to our capacity to despair and hate, hope and love. This should encourage us to consider the risks of habitual derision and endless irony manifested around us today. After the 2012 presidential election, Princeton professor Christy Wampole published a much-discussed article in the New York Times titled "How to Live Without Irony." After the 2016 election, she wrote another one titled "How to Live Without Irony." For real this time. In neither article, she didn't do one in 2020, just for the record. In neither article does she question irony's importance as a rhetorical device. But she does question irony as a way of life, proposing that it has become the regrettable ethos of our age, that's her phrase, saturated by digital technology like no people ever before. Everything can seem so virtual that you start to forget what it is you're actually serious about. We feel real in the unreal, direct in the indirect, present in absence, and it's also, well, ironic. Is this huge shift in the human experience okay? I don't know, we shrug. Wampole talks about how taking the veil of irony is hard to resist. It's too easy to hide behind the ironic mantle, she writes. It's interesting, even ironic, that Wampole describes irony in religious language, like a taking the veil or a wearing a mantle. And what is the laughter that accompanies this ironic age? At its worst, I think the best name we have for it is Snark. Or perhaps we can call it snofter. That's trademarked, by the way. Now, before you start to think that I am building to a rousing get off your phone conclusion, it's worth pointing out that irony as an existential mode or philosophical position has a pedigree much older than digital technology. In the late 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche recommended the ironic attitude as the best way to live life to the full once you've seen through the false comforts of metaphysics and religion. Nietzsche admired liberated intellects like his own, who detect that the conceptual frameworks that media intellects cling to, I think that's me, are nothing but scaffolding to smash apart and then patch together in what he called an ironic fashion. Nietzsche was clear about the laughter that would accompany his nihilistic irony. His fictional alter ego, Zarathustra, the same chap who said, "God is dead and we've killed him," affirms life despite its meaninglessness with a laughter, a snafter, that scorns the gullibility of all those who don't share his ironic disposition. "You all look up when you desire sublimity," taunts Zarathustra, "and I look down because I am sublime. Can any of you laugh and be sublime at the same time?" Zarathustra's sublime snafter takes him to mountain peaks, an ironic distance from which to laugh with not desperate but defiant independence. Late 20th century postmodern philosophers like Michel Foucault, Gianni Vattimo, and Umberto Eco embraced Nietzsche's defiant philosophical irony and its accompanying laughs. Foucault's epochal book, The Order of Things, begins with a memorable description of his laughter upon realizing that all the familiar landmarks of his thought were collapsing. What I find remarkable is the strange kinship between the confident, nihilistic laughter of the philosophers and the weary or wearying snark that Walpole fears is endemic in our own uncertain times. Walpole doesn't name the philosophical forebears that I've just named, but it's hard not to see that kinship. Could it be that our culture has inadvertently swallowed a philosophical pill whose side effects are quite at odds with what we ultimately desire? Have we consented not to an irony that liberates, but to snark that severs and suffocates? Laughter may be the best medicine, but what if it's the wrong, or it's a counterfeit laughter? What comes after snark? A world completely devoid of humor? This begs the question, if we find ourselves habituated to snark from the middle school lunchroom onward, can we still hope to shape the habit and recover a better laughter, one that heals without hurt, one that hopes, and one that restores? So this is my final section now. Can laughter heal? So as examples of laughter that heals, hopes, and restores, I'm going to conclude this evening by reflecting on two literary excerpts, one from Jane Austen's novel Emma, and the other from C.S. Lewis's The Magician's Nephew. In both excerpts, laughter is key to understanding the possibilities for human flourishing that the fiction proposes. Both passages bring together a group of people in a beautiful, warm setting that should be conducive to the virtues of joyful friendship and peaceful conviviality. In both instances, laughter interrupts unawares. Important things suddenly hang in the balance. How each situation resolves will offer a little glimpse of laughter working its healing magic, showing its restorative potential to make us better friends and better people. The example from Jane Austen's Emma is the famous Box Hill picnic scene. I'm going to play a clip from the excellent 2020 movie version, which does a marvelous job of exploring the intricacies of Austen's writing. The picnic has been much anticipated by Emma, behind me, who is characterized by charm, wit, and total cluelessness. She flirts with the handsome Frank Churchill, a young man she's been eyeing for some time. Her obsession with Frank makes her oblivious to her fellow picnickers, including the ever-wise Mr. Knightley and the hapless Miss Bates, played here by none other than Miranda Hart, the same comedian who fell in the grave in my previous video clip. In this scene, Frank proposes a game. Everyone has to say something really clever, or two things that are a bit clever, or three really boring things, three dull things. You're going to see Emma crack a cool joke at the expense of Miss Bates. And then we're all going to endure the fallout. Snark turns out to have an 18th century vintage. We feel its awfulness just like the text message we wish we hadn't sent. There's nothing virtual about Emma's snarky comments, however. The real humorist in this scene, however, is not Emma, Her snark prompts silence. The real humorist is the earnest Miss Bates herself, who makes the original joke at her own expense, confident that the bonds of friendship leave room for her to be her chatty, awkward, straightforward self and be loved for it. Here's the passage we just watched as Austen writes it. I'm not going to try and imitate them, but let's look at the interruption here. Looking round with the most good-humored dependence upon everybody's assent. That's the little narrative interpolation there. And then Emma could not resist. And then she says her mean thing right after that. Emma's snark hurts Miss Bates, but it also hurts the living network of friendship and trust on which Emma herself depends. When Miss Bates cracks her original self-deprecating joke, she looks around with the most good-humored dependence on everybody's assent. And in the movie, we hear her friends assent to the joke with generous, not hurtful laughter. Let's recall once again the baby's laughter of unadulterated dependence. Miss Bates's laughter of good-humored dependence seems to share something important with that. Philosopher Alistair MacIntyre offers helpful language to explain what's at stake here in his book Dependent Rational Animals. MacIntyre argues that in order to preserve our common good, we must acknowledge that our capacity to be, to act, and to decide independently is anchored in how dependent we are on what he calls networks of uncalculated giving and receiving. To be independent is to know what we depend upon. For this, we need to cultivate the virtues of what he calls acknowledged dependence, among which he includes just generosity, truthfulness, and humility. In passing, MacIntyre uses the example of cruel laughter as the opposite of these virtues of acknowledged dependence. If I am to be trustworthy and reliable, he says, I must know that no matter how absurd I may be, and no matter how witty you are, you will not make jokes that bring me into contempt. For MacIntyre, this is human flourishing 101. Emma does indeed bring Miss Bates into contempt on Box Hill. But it's Miss Bates, with her laughter of good-humored dependence, who is my heroine. And so is Miranda, by the way. She is deaf to Emma's snark. It makes no sense to her. Emma later uses this in her defense when Mr. Knightley challenges her for being so kind of mean and unfeeling toward Miss Bates. But what Mr. Knightley has seen in the unfortunate Miss Bates as she processed the event is the opposite of what Emma has displayed. Miss Bates, he thinks, shows candor and generosity and forbearance. Those are quotes. Words all but synonymous with MacIntyre's truthfulness, just generosity and humility, the virtues of acknowledged dependence. She has taken a cruel joke as best as she can, and her capacity to do so has evident healing potential for everyone involved. Emma's snark, in contrast, asserts her independence and superiority at the cost of self-isolation. Now, this is a novel which is a comedy, not a tragedy, and so we do not need to worry about Emma. The Box Hill episode propels her from snark to remorse and towards self-knowledge. Emma lives to laugh again, and it will be a laughter of newly acknowledged dependence that becomes more truthful, more generous, and more humble. My final example takes us to another bucolic setting, this time not the English countryside, but C.S. Lewis's fantastical land of Narnia, just moments after the creator lion Aslan has sung it into being in The Magician's Nephew. Let's exchange the social mores of an 18th century picnic for a new world resplendent with life. At the center of a circle of talking beasts is not a picnic hamper, but a glorious lion who is welcoming his creatures into life and inviting them to share in the goodness of all that surrounds them. This creation scene has the theological advantage of being prelapsarian, so it's still untouched by a fall from grace. In fact, the whole scene sparkles with the grace of things being given with majestic freedom and received with grateful joy. "Creatures, I give you yourselves," said the strong, happy voice of Aslan. "I give to you forever this land of Narnia. I give you the woods, the fruits, the rivers. I give you the stars, and I give you myself." Aslan warns the talking beasts not to go back to the way of the dumb beasts. And everyone eagerly responds, "No, Aslan, we won't. Except that is for the one little bird who gets his timing wrong." And this is the quote on here. But one perky jackdaw added in a loud voice, "No fear!" And everyone else had finished just before he said it, so that his words came out quite clear in a dead silence. And perhaps you have found out how awful that can be, say at a party. The jackdaw became so embarrassed that it hid its head under its wing as if it were going to sleep. And all the other animals began making various queer noises, which are their way of laughing, and which, of course, no one has ever heard in our world. They tried at first to repress it, but Aslan said, "Laugh and fear not, creatures. Now that you are no longer dumb and witless, you need not always be grave. For jokes, as well as justice, come in with speech." Aslan's fine words are a blessing on laughter and its powers. They also restore the jackdaw's confidence, and he plucks up the courage to ask his creator, "Have I made the first joke?" "No, little friend," said the lion, "you have not made the first joke, you have only been the first joke." Interestingly, the humor here, Aslan's joke, has elements of all three standard theories of comedy: superiority, he's a big old lion, incongruity, and release. But the humor is from top to bottom good, not belittling the jackdaw, but ennobling him in his littleness. After Aslan's witty comeback, everyone laughed more and more, but the jackdaw didn't mind and laughed just as loud. He laughs so hard that he loses his balance and falls off his perch, remembering only just in time that he is a bird with wings. He is, after all, a new creation who hasn't had much of a chance to use them yet. What's so clever about this scene is that the jest at the jackdaw's expense culminates in him taking flight. The slapstick fall doesn't end with a splat, but ends with a soaring bird. He's been the first joke, but he's also taken his first flight. The beautiful fruit of all of this shared laughter is the jackdaw himself, more fully alive, more fully himself. So to conclude, in a poem that I know many of you know, and some of you know it because I taught it to you last week, Jared Manley Hopkins celebrates just this kind of graced vitality. Hopkins, it has to end with Hopkins, by the way, doesn't it? Doesn't everything in humanities end with Hopkins? Hopkins describes how things speak forth what or who they are. Kingfishers catch fire, and dragonflies draw flame, just as the just man justices. Perhaps we could add a line to the poem to include this scene from Lewis's novel, as jackdaws tumble upward, and as lions roar with laughter. One of laughter's powers seems to be making us more or less ourselves. Emma's cruel witticism lets Miss Bates down, but a different kind of humor bears the jackdaw up. The good society of which he is a part doesn't question the self-evident fact that each creature depends on the other. The Narnians have not yet weighed the options of being apart over being together. And in this they resemble Miss Bates, whose laughter of good-humored, acknowledged dependence turns out to be far more efficacious, more life-giving in the long run than Emma's quick wits. Now perhaps it's because I'm as guilty as anyone of defaulting to snafter and snarkasm that I find the mystery of laughter that consoles, that restores, unites, heals, frees, that humanizes, to be both so attractive and yet so hard to define, so hard to describe. Laughter is often the thing that follows from something rather than the thing itself, and so its distinctiveness can pass us by. Fiction turns out to be a good place to discover laughter in all its many forms, poeticized and animated in adverb and metaphor. Indeed, I think this is an important insight into what narrative fiction can be, a repository of the mystery of imagined human persons charting their cosmic course between tragedy and comedy. If Miss Bates' laughter of acknowledged dependence is anything to measure by, and if it is a real corrective to the laughter of desperate or defiant independence, then I'm going to conclude by proposing that our laughter has a lot to do with how we understand our responsibilities toward others. How we laugh somehow measures how we love. At its best, perhaps laughter in life and in art is nothing less than irrepressible bursting forth of a lasting joy we hardly dare imagine, of possibilities so magnificent that they contract our diaphragm, even as they expand our hearts. The end. So, questions, or I can just play video clips again.
No, not back hill.
I said about cold.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so...
Oh, Nick, hi.
Hi. So, for you, when exactly does a joke, or like specifically a dark joke, cross a line and like, instead of like bolster our humanity, kind of deprive us of being fully human? Because I think a lot of people in today's world, their humor is like that, quote, dark humor. So it's like, I don't know, making a joke at another group's expense, or putting, like you said, putting yourself above another group. So I was just wondering if you had a perspective on like, when does a joke go too far?
Yeah, I read that quote from Aston McIntyre where he says, however kind of absurd I am and however witty you are, sometimes you will make the judgment call not to crack that joke. And that does seem to be a really difficult act of judgment that's involved. You mentioned the kind of intergroup jokes, like that's a really hard call to make, isn't it? Some of the best jokes are those jokes, should they be made? And so I think this is where I was sort of going into this language of kind of networks of giving and receiving, and of dependence and interdependence, because I think if that gets forgotten, if we function as if we were fully independent of one another, we are going to be so much more likely to crack that joke that crosses the line. But I think it's just like a lot of human life where we're trying to sort of find that mark, and it's just so hard to perceive. Some people have argued, I don't actually agree with this, but some people have argued that humor is a bit like a virtue, and so, you know, there is a mean and there's an excess and a deficiency, and your jokes, if they're good jokes, they'll hit the mark in some way, and they would be fair and they wouldn't be cruel. I'm not entirely convinced by that argument, but it would be one way to go to sort of have at least a sort of scheme of where the line is crossed between something that hurts in this kind of destructive way, and something that in a way is reinforcing our mutual interdependence. That's a hard question. It's really hard, and we all get it wrong a lot. Yeah.
Humor like varies so much, like cross-culturally. Like, well, one of my culture finds funny is gonna like hit the same way as other culture. So like, in light of that, like, how do you think, and like in light of like the like cultural healing, like intercultural healing that I think like our world needs, how do you think like humor like plays a role there in terms of like things getting lost in translation, but still like potentially having the role of healing?
Yeah, such a good question. I'm if you haven't noticed yet, I'm English. I've lived here for a long time. At a certain point, while having lived here for a decade or so, I realized I wasn't getting the jokes in like the sort of comic pages in newspapers. That really bothered me because it felt like I'd lost some contact with my own culture. And I've experienced that in another way. I'm a scholar of German, and I've lived in Germany, I've lived in Italy, and it's when you get the humor that you really know if there is any. I had to crack that joke. That's like a little group joke right there. Like saying Germans don't have a sense of humor, but they do. Live stream world, they do excellent sense of humor. But yeah, no. I mean, when you've mastered the language, you will get the jokes. And if you haven't mastered language, you won't. And that seems to be sort of like an analogy for the lack of mutual understanding that we can often have. So I have to admit, though, there are certain forms of the kind of humor that I've been describing that actually sort of do, like the baby's laughter. I challenge a culture that doesn't have this kind of sense of contagiousness of the baby's laughter. And I think there are other forms of like slapstick humor that you don't need language. If you ever had a pen pal come from another country and you realized you were all kind of, you couldn't communicate, but you could, if somebody tripped over their lace, you were all going to laugh at it. So I do think that there's something interesting about humor and its relationship to language that suggests that there are ways in which humor can be a bond, even though it's very clear that we don't get other cultures' jokes, we don't get other time periods' jokes, and we tend to look at the jokes of the past and be like, really? You thought that was funny? It's just lost on us. So another really, really good question. And also just worth saying, it seems the more I think about humor, the more I realize I'm thinking about other things. Like it does seem to be a way to think about some of our most challenging questions, like how do we get along? It seems to be a corollary to those bigger questions. Yeah. Casey?
One of the things you said at the end that I just love so much is you said you described laughter as a bursting forth of joy from the diaphragm and the heart. And I just love that line because I feel like it really gets at like the body and soul experience of laughter. And so I thought I would just ask your kind of thinking through of this in another humanities bingo text, Babette's Feast, and kind of like what's going on at that feast is like the elevation of the laughter as well with like the food and drink and everything in that kind of body and soul experience.
Yeah.
So.
I'm so glad you picked up on that because I think that's again one of the scary things about laughter sometimes is that we don't mean to do it. It comes upon us and it comes upon us like a big sneeze. Like it's like you don't have control over this thing. And your body is doing it. And it also can feel like a total like body-soul experience, can't it? The eruption of the body. And we know it kind of changes chemicals in the body and does all these important things. So also, Casey, kudos for spotting. If I was going to bore you for even longer, I was going to have a section on Babette's Feast. Because if you've seen the movie version of it, at the end, these people have had this, they're an older community and they've got high ideals, but they've just been letting it slip and they're kind of stale and things haven't been going well for them as a community. And then this French chef shows up and on this one night, after living with them for many years, she cooks them a meal unlike any meal they've ever had. They all get a little bit drunk, they're not used to alcohol, and it's this whole kind of resurrection of them kind of in this body and soul way. At the end in the movie, they go out and they kind of play Ring-a-Ring-a-Rosy around the well and they're sort of tripping over. But in the book, that scene is described as the whole thing being like a blessed joke. Like that's the quote. So I think Babette's Feast really is a very good example of the healing potential of laughter as these slightly drunk older folk kind of reminisce and reconnect with one another over food in this real kind of physical and spiritual, all the things way. And the author, her language really pinpoints that when she says that the whole thing actually has been this blessed joke and this meal was almost like a joke. They were the ones who were lampooned, but they were lampooned with wonderful food that brought them into sort of a higher experience of themselves and one another. Yeah. Oh.
Thanks so much, Dr. Tomko. I was thinking about Aslan at the end, and a comment from G.K. Chesterton that God hides his mirth from us. And I was thinking about the Beatitudes that you quoted, and I guess my question is, why doesn't Jesus ever tell any jokes?
Oh, I think he does.
And why do we think that he doesn't?
Yeah, I think that's the more interesting question.
Yeah.
Why do we think, like, why do we have this kind of CCD attitude towards what's going on?
So my brother, who's 2 years younger than me, is my oldest son's godfather. And I remember after Mass one day, my son said, Max said, "Why is Uncle Michael always sad when he prays?" And I thought, yeah, that's the image that we have, right, of a kind of seriousness and a lack of mirth. And I wonder, why do you think we think of humor as opposed to piety, maybe, or as opposed to what is close to God's heart? One of the things I love about Lewis's Aslan, he taught me that God actually has a sense of humor.
Yeah. So much in there. One of the things is, I don't really think Chesterton meant that line's super famous, that Christ hid his mirth from us. It's almost like when we get to heaven, it'll just be a great laugh, but just be serious about it right now. Like, that's the sense you get from it. I don't think Chesterton really meant that, because elsewhere Chesterton says completely the opposite. He actually says divine revelation is the closest thing we have to a good joke. So he really doesn't think that. I think he was responding to something Nietzsche says in the Zarathustra book, where he says that Christ lost his sense of humor. He should have hung out in the desert, and then he wouldn't have lost his sense of humor. So I think Chesterton's trying to work with Nietzsche a little bit there. But the more interesting question of why we don't perceive the kind of humor I'm trying to describe as healing, restorative, consoling humor, why don't we perceive that in the New Testament? Because actually it's everywhere in the scriptures. I think maybe to do with our sort of biblical imagination sort of being almost formed for the dower. Because the attitude I quoted, blessed are those who weep now, for they shall laugh. That's in Luke's gospel, and right after it, you get the scene where Christ says, before you take a splinter out of your friend's eye, make sure you take the plank out of your own eye. I was like, can you imagine that scene? Okay, big plank in your eye. I'm going to take the splinter out of my friend's eye with this big plank. You're going to have a complete slapstick encounter with that plank. And guess what? If you removed, it's gross, but if you did remove the plank from your own eye, then you could go over, remove the splinter from your friend's eye. We often need to help one another when we have things in our eyes. It would be healing. So I actually think that's my favorite example, because I can't think people wouldn't laugh at that if you sort of imagined it. So that's my answer. I think it's a question of how our biblical imagination's just being a bit dry, and that's more on us than on the scriptures.
Yeah, a quick comment about that, and then I have a question. When I teach Genesis and the Tower of Babel, and I'm teaching a class, and they're trying to build this tower up to God. And then it says, and God looked down to see what they were doing. Isn't that funny? And students are like, how? No, there can't be jokes in the Bible. There just can't be.
Yeah, but the logic too of the logic of the brokenness and then the restoration is just that's the story of the whole Bible. And in a way, that's the kind of the potential in laughter that I feel like literature just keeps giving evidence for, even when it's sort of not intended. So many of the laughs that we love best are the ones that do that work of restoring what was broken.
So the question I had, and I'm sure since you started originally, as I understand it, from thinking about satire, you must have thought a lot about this prior to thinking about these things. But if you could say something about the relationship of laughter and humor to truth, because one of the things that struck me immediately was, in a certain sense, the Platonic dialogues are all comedies. They're comedies because, everyone else is kind of fumbling around in the dark while Socrates knows what's going on the whole time, right? But I was thinking in terms of all of your different theories in relation to that, right? So that's clearly, right, the sort of philosophic humor in that sense is clearly a matter of superiority of vision.
But when it's Socrates, it's also done humbly, isn't it? It's not done in a haughty way. He's also prepared to kind of accept jokes at his own expense. And I also think a nice distinction I see is two different kinds of irony. So I was talking about this kind of destructive kind of irony that strips down and there's nothing under it. I think Socratic irony is just a different kind. It's like it's stripping down so you find the thing, so you find the truth of reality. So I think that is just that's what satire is for in its kind of least destructive sense, is chipping away at lies and kind of false versions of things, and through doing that, kind of reasserting what is true. So I think that's the kind of classic corrective function of satire, and irony is the toolkit for doing that. Yeah. Any other remaining questions? I feel the call of the cookies there. Brad.
So about like the humor, gee, everyone just turned around. So about like the humor that heals and like the laughter that heals. It seems that when I try to picture laughter that hurts people's feelings, it's always like one group of people against like another group of people, or against one other person or something. So like when I try to see humor that heals, I kind of think of like the example from The Magician's Nephew, and it's like everyone can laugh at the situation, or the person that maybe did a pratfall or something, and everyone can be better off as a result. So it seems like the humor that heals is there's a unifying aspect to that, instead of kind of I place myself above someone else in my kind of snarkiness and then laugh at how dumb they all look, from my pedestal, like Zarathustra kind of. So.
Yeah, and I think that's like the permission slip that I think we give ourselves all the time when we do crack a joke at somebody's expense, especially when they don't know we're cracking it. Which is why I like the Emma thing, because it's so much like what happens kind of now on the internet, but they're like all sitting together. It just, you feel it, so real, don't you? So I think we give ourselves these permission slips, and I would just propose that I kept referring to laughter as having powers, and like I actually meant that quite seriously. Like it has powers, so becoming kind of mindful of that, and also of the way in which kind of remembering that we belong to one another is a way to sort of keep even the intergroup laughter in check. And keep it good-natured, because, like I said, I think some of the intergroup humor is really helpful when it's done without that destruction, without that loathing, without that hatred. So it does seem that love is one of the sort of the necessities for laughter to heal. Yeah, I think it's the higher the thing we're capable of, the better the laugh is going to be. Yeah.
I know we said that laughter could heal, but do you think that like an entire relationship or friendship could be like primarily laughter without any like genuine conversations or anything like that, because when I think back on like my past best friends, it's always been like just teasing each other and never like actual genuine conversations, but those are my best relationships I've had. So is that possible? Do you think it's possible to have?
I mean, everyone, it's so good to have friends who laugh and have a good sense of humor. So yeah, but I would actually say that we probably all had friendships somewhere along the way that was simply about making mean jokes about people. That's the kind of middle school lunchroom. But there's something just joyful about friendships that are habituated in laughter. You know, like those are the best ones, aren't they? So yeah, like I said earlier, when you start talking about laughter, you find yourself talking about a lot of other things. And friendship does seem to be one of the places where we experience laughter most, but also maybe one of the places where laughter can become something like a measure, like a toxic friendship or something. Like if all we're ever doing together is tearing other people down through extremely clever jokes, what is our friendship? You know, don't say that to your friends, that's not. but vice versa, if there's kind of a joyful laughter, kind of freeing, liberating laughter in your friendship. Those are the friends to hold on to. So I think that's a really nice question. Just a quick aside, the first time I ever met the other Dr. Tomko, he cracked a joke, which I've still not got. But I do like being married to somebody who has a good sense of humor. What was the joke? Oh, I don't know.
I think we realized pretty early on that we had Philadelphia in common as a background, and I made a not so nice joke about Philadelphia, which is the city of love, so it's not appropriate.
Yeah. And here we are.
So I hope you will all join me in thanking the other Dr. Tomko for this really